Robert Massoud is legendary in the Palestinian Solidarity Committee. Many people know him from Beit Zatoun, that wonderful place for ideas on Markham Street for 7 years. One of the greatest place for conversations, and it wasn't always about the Middle East. So Robert was the first person I thought about that would give us a phenomenal insight from his unique perspective. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Robert Massoud.
Thank you so much. It is so good to be back with you. I recognize so many faces in the room and also online. These are names that I've known now for many, many years, as long as 20 years through Zatoun and then Beit Zatoun. And I cannot tell you what that means to me and what that means to Palestinians, to have people supporting them, and I would even say love them for who they are and what they represent. So really the most heartfelt thanks that I can give for your presence here today in person and online. Thank you. So for tonight, how could we be positive and feel good about what is happening? But we have to. We have to see the light in the darkness. That is all we can do. That is our greatest challenge. Because we just see darkness upon darkness upon darkness, and you think, can it get any darker? And it does. And it breaks your heart, and it crushes your soul. But it can't stop you. And so this is really the topic of tonight. How do we go beyond the sorrow and the darkness? And for this, I want to just briefly mention a quotation or a reference from a friend of mine in Manitoba, a Mennonite, who, when he learned of this project, or not this project, but this event, he borrowed from theology's prophetic imagination. And that's bringing a new future by naming a vision that we see before it is manifest in the world. This is our job. This is the best way we can move forward as a humanity and how we can support Palestine. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I cannot begin without first acknowledging the deep pain and loss so many are suffering, either as direct victims in Gaza or the rest of Palestine, their families and their people. Also, the reality of faraway witness who is awake to the suffering of others and feels united with all humanity. They feel a different kind of sorrow. Let us note that the Arabic word shaheed is the same for martyr and witness. In English, we have two separate words, but the Latin root for martyr is to witness. Very significantly, for decades now, Palestinians refer to their dead killed by Israel as martyrs, not as victims. They have a sensibility of a deeper truth about death as a relationship to the whole and not simply an event befalling an individual. Tonight, let us declare that we are all martyrs, some in body and billions more in witness. To us, this talk is dedicated to try to make some sense, if any is to be found, and to look to a better future, if any can be envisioned. I think they can. I want to thank our hosts for the invite to be part of the series, Keeping Hope Alive. If I may, I have a bone to pick with hope. For me, it is a kind of mystery, a paradoxical yet fundamental quality of being human. We live faithfully in hope, despite having our hopes dashed almost daily, and on some days, most cruelly. I say that nowhere is this living in hope more true than in Palestine, Israel. Every person here tonight who supports Palestine has lived this. Many have been living in hope for peace in Palestine and Israel for 30, 40, or even more years. Hope is the operative word when speaking about Palestine. It seems to go nowhere and bring very little. Certainly Palestinians inside Palestine and the refugee camps and scattered across the globe and the Middle East have also lived in hope these 75 years. Perhaps it's more accurate to say we all live in the frustration of hope. Let us pray that it will change. What to make of hope, which springs eternal and is crushed repeatedly? The Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, friend and ally of Salvador Allende, I think said it best. Action is the mother of hope. He is telling us there is no hope without action. That action takes many forms. Supporters of Palestine should know. We have tried them all over and over again, and we will go on trying. However, I believe we have come to a point, an inflection point, that is a moment in reality where the momentum or flow begin to reverse. October 7th, and in the last 5 months, the moment has turned into a movement. We are looking at a different future, and difficult as it may be to believe, maybe a better future. This is the topic for tonight. Before getting into a specific topic, I want to say something about the title and the image chosen for the poster. It is not on the screen, so I hope you can recall it. I think the image is very important to tonight because it graphically depicts the context and the background of our modern human existence. We recognize the iconic and searing image entitled The Scream by Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, painted in 1893. It speaks to us because it captures a most human response to its time and what was to follow in the 20th and 21st century. The alienation, the isolation, the quiet desperation, the anguish, the loss of faith, the moral injury to the soul. Absolute horror mixed with honest puzzlement at how can this be when modernity promised us so much. Frankly, this is how I think supporters of Palestine feel most of the time. And now, since October 7th and the bombing of Gaza, the rest of the world does also. This is perhaps a good time to mention that I use Gaza and Palestine almost interchangeably. Unfortunately, through 55 years of occupation, Israel has managed to divide Palestine in people's minds into Gaza and the West Bank as separate realities and identities. They may be geographically separate, but they are one people, united in aspiration and the search for their liberation. Returning to the painting, we can imagine that no sound is coming from the open mouth. The figure stands speechless by the unutterable horror they witness. This is another hallmark of supporters for Palestine, made speechless by the brutalization of language, shameless disregard for truth, and not to mention utter contempt for Palestinian lives and human life. This situation of paralysis and helplessness is magnified by the engineered voicelessness of the victim and the witness by institutional power in the West. Again, never on display as since October the 7th. More can be said about this extraordinary painting, but let us ask, why the title Palestine, Israel, upside down? I've always felt that the world presented to us by our public institutions and media is an inversion of reality, or upside down, mired in fabrication, half-truths, and innumerable gaslighting techniques. We have been living an upside-down reality, and now we hope that what was once upside down for most of our lives is being flipped right side up, giving a true representation of reality. Turned into a concentration camp and prison, Gaza in the last 17 years, and especially in the last 5 months, has been a magnifying glass looking at monstrous horror. And we are all looking through it. But at what cost to Palestinians living in Gaza? It is as if we are looking at an insensate, brutish bully gleefully using a magnifying glass to burn defenseless ants scurrying below with nowhere to go. Israel, with its death from above, is that bully for all to see, and now cannot unsee. Gaza is also the mirror which reflects back to us. Who are we? What have we come to? Where are we going? What are we doing? Where are our leaders? Gaza today and Palestine for the last 75 years is a mirror into the world's soul. In the 90s, Clovis Massoud, a diplomat from the Arab League, said, "Palestine is the anvil of our souls." And more recently, Mustafa Bayoumi, a New York professor, ended an article on Edward Said with the sentence, "Palestine will save your soul, but it will also break your heart." I apologize for what seems like an overly long opening remarks, but everything about Palestine requires a lengthy preamble, time to build context, without which it cannot be fully understood. When October 7th happened, our world changed. This is not news. It has been said from the beginning in different ways by many writers and commentators. I hope to bring it together in tonight's wide-ranging talk and look at the many dimensions and ways that October 7th changed everything. It is not immodest when speaking of Palestine to say it cannot be viewed in isolation of the wider world. For all its tiny size, it has played a huge role in world history, and I would say even more than we know, because so much is yet hidden. Please recall the most famous of all this changes everything moment, September the 11th, 2001, when the World Trade Center went down. Other events since then have been announced as much or as such, but more for publicity and rhetorical purposes. I want to propose that 9/11 and October 7th are bookmarks on the war on terror launched in 2001. I mean that the war of terror has run its course and we are at the beginning of the end. I hasten to say not the end, only the beginning, because it's a lengthy process of decline. In the 22 years, the US and the entire West have been diminished, while the non-West has risen, expanding their capacity to resist and seek greater independence. This can be seen from the BRICS, which of course stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Alignment, which is a main counterforce to the US and NATO, and is taking on new member nations at every general meeting. You may think that this is too grand a view, but reality is that Israel was from the beginning very much in the inner sanctum of the war on terror. And so October 7th is an event of great consequence and rightly belongs in the same league as the aftermath of 9/11. October 7th was more than just shuffling the cards in the same deck. A better analogy is the grand chessboard made famous by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. It is the seminal book venerated by US elites and Western governments when thinking about world geopolitics and projecting power. I contend that October 7th has upended the chessboard and scattered the pieces. Maybe we are no longer even playing chess, but something entirely different. Speaking of chessboard, I think it reasonable to link the war on Gaza to the war in Ukraine. Russia upended Brzezinski's grand theme or grand theory in Europe and North Asia. Gaza upended it in the Southwest Asia and the Middle East. The result is sure signs of paralysis or aimless scurrying of the West. Nothing seems to work and only makes things worse. This is equally true for Israel as the regional superpower. This is not obvious seeing the tremendous power to destroy, but peering into the future, we can see a blind alley leading to a strategic dead end. Strategic here means creating or preserving future options or openings to continue or improve declared interests. The West and Israel face a qualitatively different future, which will not afford them the control and impunity they have been accustomed to for many decades now. This is a clear positive for the rest of the world. In any competent investigation, there are three main questions. What happened? So what? And now what? However important it is to answer what happened with true or accurate facts, it is not the focus of this talk. Our goal tonight is so what? That is to understand the significance of what happened. And maybe in Q&A, we might get to answer now what? Basically being actions arising. In seeking significance and impact, I've identified three dimensions for us tonight: the physical, social, and the spiritual. These are reflected respectively in the military, the narrative, and the soul or moral. Of course, none of these are mutually exclusive and all live simultaneously and mix together in daily life. In each of these three areas, military, narrative, moral, somehow, Israel from its earliest days has been placed on a pedestal, a very high one. The plucky little country that made the desert bloom, the startup nation with invincible military, the only democracy and a virtuous, peace-loving state in an uncivilized neighborhood. And finally, a uniquely moral country chosen by God to serve as a light onto the nations. A maddeningly loop of tired talking points repeated ad nauseum, thanks to a global amplifier which cannot be turned off. We will not inquire tonight about how or why it got on the pedestal. Suffice to say that we have lived it as activists who for decades could hardly dent the grand stature of Israel in the West. The greatest achievement of October 7th is that it knocked Israel off the pedestal. It broke the hypnotic spell that held us confused, blind, deaf, and dumb. In the first weeks following October 7th, Israel went from apartheid regime to genocide regime, in reality and in world opinion. We say that Israel did it to itself, out of hubris, the timeless Greek concept to describe excessive pride or arrogance. It describes a character or state believing themselves invincible and above the law. This overconfidence leads to making mistakes or taking risks that ultimately lead to downfall. The eternal but strictly unscientific universal law maintains the balance and harmony in human life. Think of it as the equivalent of the balance of nature, which operates in the natural world. And we must credit the quiet resolve and the steadfastness of the Palestinian people who carried them to this inflection point. With dignity and mostly nonviolent resistance, they withstood decades of systemic racism, legalized murder, systemic land and resource theft, restrictions of all kinds, destruction of homes and society, arbitrary imprisonment, and endless attempts at erosion of identity and capacity to withstand. October 7th announced for this generation that liberation would come from Palestinians. Activists here in Canada and elsewhere in the West did what they could to help Palestine by bringing greater awareness within our civil society, our governments, and our institutions. Unfortunately, we had only limited success because we face a formidable Israel lobby at every turn. It took the Palestinians to break out of their prison, to have their own ghetto uprising, to seek their own liberation. Ours here is a supporting role. We recall the words of Terence McSweeney, an Irish martyr who died in 1920 after a 74-day hunger strike in a British prison. And he said, "It is not those who inflict the most, but those that endure the most who shall conquer." Is October 7th that point where the endurance of Palestinians brought them to great hope, even amidst the great horror? Even so, sadly, I fear they are yet to endure more, and Israel to inflict more. Although it may not be obvious from the mainstream media reporting and analysis, Israel is in rapid decline. The most astute and knowledgeable commentators on the region have said or written as much. Chris Hedges, Norman Finkelstein, Ilan Pape, Jonathan Cook, Joseph Massoud, Alistair Crook, Scott Ritter, and many others, who unfortunately do not register with the mainstream and therefore are invisible to average Canadians. However, just this month, Foreign Affairs, the august publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, considered by many the heart and mind of the American empire, ran an article entitled "Israel's Self-Destruction, Netanyahu, the Palestinians, and the Price of Neglect." Unthinkable a few months ago that the Council on Foreign Relations would even consider such a title or such a possibility. Or that 100 journalists would rebel against the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC employers. That bureaucrats resign their posts in the White House, in the UN, in European capitals. That world streets would be flooded for 20 straight weeks with millions of ordinary people. That the International Court of Justice would rule plausible genocide against Israel. That the US would need to cast 3 vetoes in the Security Council. That China would declare at the ICJ that armed struggle against occupation is not terrorism. That the long maligned axis of evil is reborn across the world as the axis of resistance. To put it mildly, this is upside down. From the steady diet of news we are fed or have been fed. All these are near revolutionary developments marking Israel's decline. To help us understand this, let us think of Israel as a product which has been exposed for gross false advertising. It made grand product claims it does not and cannot possibly fulfill. Israel, as conceived, designed, and created, could not deliver because its raw materials and production process could not result in the exalted product promised. The advertising blitz, otherwise known as the Israeli narrative, has fallen off the edge of the earth. Maybe not in the mainstream, or Trudeau or Biden, but reality, like gravity, has a way of asserting itself. That reality is the innumerable internal contradictions of Zionism in Israel, has never been resolved, and have been stewing since the creation of Israel, of the state in 1948 and even before. Contradictions are irreconcilable opposites existing at the same time in the same place. The nature of contradictions is to either resolve or to implode. And 75 years is time enough for them to go one way or the other. To the chagrin of the world, in Israel's case, the contradictions may explode rather than just implode quietly. In no particular order, let me offer a small selection of contradictions. Israel not only claims, but categorically insists that at the same time, it is democratic and Jewish, secular and religious, Zionist and Jewish, same as other nations, but different from other nations, normal and special, Israel's citizenship, and Jewish nationality. Other contradictions we can observe for ourselves. Security for Jews in a very insecure place. Victims, but serial victimizer. Solution to anti-Semitism, but mass generator of anti-Semitism. Indigenous, but relying on masked, crazed settler movements. These are only some contradictions. There are many others which I won't list. I think we can agree that these are just too many points of identity for the mental or emotional health of any single person or an entire nation. The center cannot hold. Hence the long discussed exhaustion and expected collapse of the Zionist experiment. Unfortunately, the experiment was at the expense of 6 or 7 generations of Palestinians. It cost them their country, their society, their identity, and their lives. Is that experiment over? Sadly, not yet. No one even knows what experiment being over means exactly, or how or when it will come about. But we can reasonably say is that Israel has come to a point of reckoning. It cannot continue as it has for the last 75 years. The world has changed dramatically. With the war in Ukraine, the balance and perhaps even the makeup of power in the world has shifted. It has greatly diminished the war-making capacity of the West. For Israel, it means going from an Anglo-Empire sponsor to perhaps no sponsor. And this can be fatal, for Israel has always relied on full sponsorship. Excuse me. Moving now into our investigation. Perhaps the most evident, yet still difficult to see because of censorship and media bias, is the physical or the military. After being fed a steady diet of the most powerful military in the region and one of the top and most moral militaries in the entire world, it is unimaginable for us to contemplate a relatively hapless force and serious erosion of the IDF, which is the Israel Defense Fund forces. What we see is the truly fierce power to bomb from above, but on the ground, essentially an occupation army over defenseless civilians. For the entire world, the Israel Defense Force becomes the Israeli or Israel Occupation Force for all to see, and that only enrages Israel to bomb even more and to act with greater cruelty. 5 months after Netanyahu promised to annihilate Hamas as a fighting foe, the various armed groups in Gaza are wreaking havoc on the IOF and managing to fire rockets from parts of Gaza declared cleansed by Israel. For all of Israel's military superiority in advanced heavy weapons, satellite communication, equipment and training, Hamas inside and outside the tunnels is defiant and only seems to increase in effectiveness. Hamas claims with meticulous documentation and video evidence to have destroyed or damaged 1,000 tanks and hundreds of armored vehicles, as well as militarized D9 bulldozers. As reference, according to Wikipedia, Canada has 74 tanks. The United States has 2,500 tanks. And postage stamp size Israel has 4,000 tanks. Officially, Israel says that about 250 of its soldiers have been killed. Israeli media reports, based on interviews with families and actual burials inside of Israel, suggest many times that number. Even months ago, Israeli media reported that the Veterans Department was preparing for 20,000 permanently disabled soldiers. Obviously, not the cakewalk anticipated by military planners. Gaza is already Israel's Vietnam, except that it's in its front yard, not 8,000 miles away. As a percentage of population, as many Israeli soldiers have died in 5 months as US soldiers in Vietnam died in 10 years. Moderate to seriously injured soldiers is comparable to 1.1 million US soldiers. This is already a serious blow to the IOF and to Israel. Its economy has shrunk by 20%. And this is without facing Hezbollah in Lebanon, where those numbers could be doubled or tripled, if not more. Israel is starting to look like the Ukraine military, finished in reality, but pretending to be alive on a friendly stage with a blind audience, not looking too closely. There is only one point to make here, and that is that the myth of invisibility, which is central to Israel's projection of power in the Middle East, has been shattered by a small band of ill-equipped fighters dressed in track pants and sneakers, armed with shoulder-fired rocket-propelled grenades and basic Katyusha rockets. Here we need to recall the logic of modern warfare, according to Kissinger, the chess master himself. He said, a conventional army loses if it does not win, and the guerrilla wins if he does not lose. By that calculus, it is a strategic failure for Israel, and for Palestinians, a human catastrophe. No wonder Israel's military and politicians are panicking, that Muslims are not afraid of us anymore, and clamoring for a return to the terror equation. Messing with Israel equals instant death. That equation, meted out by military policy, described as mad dog, biting at least provocation or without needing provocation, is no longer credible. It worked for many decades. The stick wielded by Israel in conjunction with the carrots offered by US as a tag team in the Middle East were the basis of normalization. And I'm sure that no honest thinking person knows what normalization means. In the weeks before October 7th, Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, announced that the Middle East has never been quieter. Netanyahu appeared in the United Nations General Assembly with a map, without showing Palestine or West Bank and Gaza, as the new Middle East, showing Greater Israel as the terminus point for a new overland trade route bypassing the Suez Canal. The economic future of the Abrahamic Accords is simply doing business with the Gulf states. Israel's normalization strategy is built on the mad dog terror and military dominance. This may help to explain the relentless and gratuitous terror on full display every day, intended to send a message more than having any practical military purpose. In the first 6 days, Israel dropped 6,000 bombs or 4,000 tons of high explosives. This is more than the US used in most years in Afghanistan, an area 1,800 times greater than Gaza. In the 80 days of after October 7th, the total was 45,000 bombs, equivalent to 65,000 tons of high explosive. Remember, Gaza fits into Toronto, south of the 401. For people outside of Toronto, this is an area of a smallish city without the suburbs. No wonder that Israel is panicked. This is even before considering the decline of the US and NATO, who have similarly been deflated in Ukraine, a real war between peer armies, or the presence of Hezbollah in the north, or entry of tiny Yemen in the Red Sea, and the militias from Syria and Iraq, and not forgetting Iran, the other regional superpower and Israel's projected arch foe. Israel can destroy, can terrorize, but the region has moved on beyond the fear of Israel. And as the carrots offered by the US, they are rapidly losing value in a shifting global power equation. Israel's hold on the Middle East is largely broken and possibly breaking further. The war of terror that targeted Arab and Islamic countries for 22 years is exhausted and has collapsed. These countries are on the move. Drones have democratized death from the sky. Technology long the domain of the West is now available to all and for very cheap. A drone costing thousands of dollars destroys one costing many millions. Guerrilla tactics with cheap technology has upended the Western military strategy, which has ruled for centuries, and the physical basis of colonialism and imperialism worldwide. We are entering an insane game. Muslim nations do not fear Israel, and Israel believes that Muslims do not fear it, only serves to ratchet up the fear and insecurity cycle. The greater existential fear and need to counter it at all costs only leads to the destruction of the other and self-destruction. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, may have worked for the nuclear age, but does not work for non-nuclear or conventional war. October 7th set this train moving. How it was planned, by whom, what were its objectives, if Israel allowed it to happen, what happened on that day, if Hamas did what it was accused of doing, or if Israel's military killed most of its own civilians. These are all interesting questions. But the bottom line reality is two. There is a genocide being committed, and it has turned the greater region upside down. The entire world is experiencing the same with the accelerated erosion of the US-led empire. It is no coincidence. Where does that leave us? It's impossible to say, but we know that the Paxes, by that the Pax Romana or Britannica or Americana, do not produce peace. Maybe it is time for a new model, and we can only pray that it is being created now. Continuing to our second realm, the social, or as I have called, the narrative sphere. This is the reality closest to us in Canada and the United States, what we know best and where we have been most engaged. The realm of narrative is where Israel does battle with the rest of the world outside of Palestine and the Middle East. We can recognize this as the war of ideas and the call for moral clarity so avidly pushed by the Zionist Israel lobby. We are expected to sign up to it as our own battle, waving the Israeli flag, and if not our battle, then just shut up. Israel is able to continue in its path because its narrative turned truth and reality upside down, claiming for itself virtues like freedom, democracy, openness, truth and justice and fairness, that it did not possess. And it ascribed the crimes and its own crimes and intentions to Arab Muslims, especially Palestinians. Terrorism, cruelty, lying and cheating, torture, stealing, treachery. We would not be wrong to extend this accusation to the greater West also. For this audience tonight and millions more, it is appropriate that we fight back at level of narrative because it is our own backyard, affecting our personal lives, civil society, our public institutions, and the use of our tax dollars for abhorrent purposes. There is no question that the Zionist narrative has been extraordinarily successful these last 100 years. It has ensured Israel's freedom with impunity to continue the late stages of its brutal settler colonial project in Palestine and to project terror in the entire Middle East. And we can also say its fair share of terrorizing the rest of the world into silence. I think we can go further and say that the narrative has embedded itself in the West to the point of colonizing the minds of its citizens. I mean, living with internalized Zionist assumptions, logic, and myths, like civilized, humane, democratic, moral army, light onto the world, Israel only defends itself, etc. Not to mention the biblical pronouncements of chosen and promised. Even when presented with clear evidence over and over again, our deepest self doubts and makes excuses for Israel. It does the opposite for Palestinians. It doubts their veracity and their humanity. This explains why the narrative is so effective and enduring. It also explains why Israel and its Western agents invest so much in maintaining it. At the same time, for the last decade and maybe longer, many have been saying that the Zionist or Israel narrative is unraveling, exposing its true colonialist and supremacist nature. This may be, but the great unraveling is painfully slow. It takes patience, a memory, doggedness, and continuity, all very demanding on individuals and groups, however much committed to justice for Palestine. Hence the periodic waves of Palestine fatigue that hits activists, all the while Israel continues to create facts on the ground and churn out lies in the air. Then came October 7th and its aftermath, the incontrovertible truth and reality of genocide in Gaza has upended the narrative, exposing Israel for what it has been, what it is, and maybe even what it will always be. It exposed not only the state's murderous bloodlust and endless deceit and game playing, but it exposed Israel's society's full participation. Incredible as it may seem, according to a recent Tel Aviv University poll, 40% of Israelis consider that the right amount of force has been used in Gaza. And 48% said not enough. Not enough force used. As well, it exposed the Israel lobby and the Zionists everywhere in the West who support the genocide. We clearly see that Netanyahu is not the problem. Israel and Zionism is the problem. By any standard, it would be considered a total PR disaster. With the images and calls to stop the killing, we would reasonably expect that Israel's narrative war on the world had suffered tremendous damage, never to recover. Truly an upside-down moment. A lesser or maybe saner player than Israel would have agreed and backtracked, but not Israel. Despite all the horrors inflicted, Israel simply doubled down and tripled down. unimaginable barbarism. No excuses, no apologies, just naked, boundless cruelty. Why? It is as if it wants to be repulsive. In some sick way, prove to the world, prove that the world hates Israel and therefore Jews. It makes no sense to normal, ordinary people. To most of us tonight, Zionism and Israel never quite made sense. The point here is not what Israel thinks or wants. For the first time since the founding of Israel, what counts is what the people of the world think and want. There is no question that Israel will continue to do what it knows, what it does best, to deny, to attack, and to reverse victim and offender roles. I say it will not work anymore. Simply too many people have seen and cannot unsee. When the world becomes indifferent and deaf to Israel's wants and ways as expressed through the narrative, it is a great upside down moment. When the Palestinian voice breaks through, even amid renewed heightened institutional silencing and anti-Palestinian racism, it is a great upside down moment. For me, I do not feel anti-Palestinian racism as hatred towards Palestinians. I feel it exclusively as silencing the Palestinian voice. I do not feel it from individual Canadians. I feel it solely from the public institutions who have largely abandoned truth, equality, or justice, except for empty virtue signaling exercises. I feel it as an affront and damage to all Canadians. More can be said about the narrative, but one last note. The platforms carrying the narrative are changing, as are the audiences. Israel's narrative relies on the mainstream and dominates older audiences inculcated by decades of Zionist logic and myths. Young people under 30, 40, or 50, even 50 get their worldview via the internet and social media, which is less prone to controlled messages and the single narrative. The demographic and change in medium is not promising for the Israel narrative. Any wonder that the internet and social media are the new arena for political control and suppression? We come to the last realm in tonight's exploration, that of spirit or soul. This is the most elusive because in a modern material technological world, especially in the West, where as a society we have come to deny or discount, or at least feel very ambivalent about the existence of spirit or soul. Like so much around us, it is a maelstrom of conflicting messages, an endless stream of pressures, dilemmas, and contradictions. No surprise then that Edvard Munch's painting speak to us. We want to scream. We can't take it anymore. But institutional structures silence us into quiet desperation, isolation, and alienation, instead of liberating us to live our full human freedoms and rights. How has October 7th turned Palestine, Israel upside down? How has it changed everything? At the most obvious level, Israel's genocidal actions in Gaza, in their untold and innumerable cruelties, has seriously dented, if not ended, Israel's and Zionism's claims to moral superiority, or even to lower than average morality. At the other end of the equation is that it has elevated Palestinians to their rightful place as longtime vanguard of resistance to colonialism and ethnic cleansing. The people of Palestine are a light and an inspiration to the people of the world. This is especially true in the last 5 months. The people of Gaza exhibited moral qualities of courage, dignity, endurance, resolve, and integrity by treating the Israelis they hold with respect and not targeting civilians. I will say it, Palestinians and Hamas, despite its Western designation as a terrorist organization, behaved with greater morality than Israel. Morality is not based on religion, is not Jewish, is not Muslim, is not Christian, or etc. This is the dirty trick of concepts like Canadian values, or Christian values, or Western values. It has set us up for a life of strife, with experts and political leaders cheerleading narrow patriotism and heroism while wearing silly flags on their lapels. This is the exact time when we should be speaking of universalism and martyrism. With these two words, universal and martyr, we need to speak of a young man, an American airman, who on Sunday calmly and resolutely set himself on fire in front of Israel's embassy in Washington. He said on social media footage just before, "I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal." As he was on fire, he shouted repeatedly, "Free Palestine, free Palestine." I confess I am still extremely shaken, especially because it was a conscious act, an ultimate statement to wake his country and fellow Americans to the genocide in Gaza. How do we understand this young man and his deed of sacrifice? Palestine and Gaza had shaken his soul and called out his world. He shook the world, as did the 30,000 civilians murdered by Israeli bombs. At a level of a people and a society, we can say that Gaza, although it did not immolate itself voluntarily, it did not flinch at the destruction brought down by Israel's fire. Today and before today, Gaza is a sacrifice zone, a call to the world to wake up from a mindless and futile search for security, a kind of sick consumerism that cannot be filled or satiated. Israel's greatest import is insecurity, which is followed by security technology and apparatus to fill the gnawing abyss of manufactured fear, only to spawn greater fear and destruction. This is the true cycle of violence, hidden from us or presented in the cartoon characters we find in action films or video games. I will read from a note by Buddhist monk and activist Thich Nhat Hanh to Martin Luther King Jr. The self-burning of Vietnamese Buddhist monks is somehow difficult for Western Christian conscience to understand. The press spoke of suicide, but in essence, it is not. It is not even protest, aimed only at alarming, at moving the hearts of the oppressor. To burn oneself by fire is to prove that what one is saying is of the utmost importance. There is nothing more painful than burning oneself. To say something while experiencing this kind of pain is to say it with the utmost courage, frankness, determination, and sincerity. This quote is how we can begin to understand Aaron Bushnell, the young man, and also the genocide of Gaza at the level of spirit and soul. What I find most chilling in Aaron's statement is his last sentence. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal. It raises the question, how do we understand ourselves as ordinary people in relation to what will be normal? I think we all live in the trauma of the witness. In a connected world, we are witnesses, willingly or not. And as such, we suffer consciously or unconsciously the soul wound of the witness. We are not the direct witness or the direct victims. We may not even be remotely the direct or indirect perpetrators, but we suffer nonetheless. During the War on Terror, a concept was developed as it concerned US soldiers returning from the Middle East. It is called moral injury. I think it is more accurate and useful than PTSD. The concept of moral injury emphasizes the psychological, cultural, and spiritual aspects of trauma. And more importantly, moral injury is a normal human response to an abnormal event or situation. It encompasses betrayal of one's core values, such as justice, fairness, and truth. Life examples are harming others, failing to protect others, or failure to be protected by leaders or elders. They can wound a person's conscience and can fundamentally alter their worldview and impair the ability to trust. Along with Aaron Bushnell, we in the West especially suffer generalized moral injury simply by daily living. How can we heal? Again, paradoxically, through a call to bear faithful witness and to do the most important work we possibly can, namely, to see evil, to speak truth, and to act for justice. This is what Gaza and Palestine offer us. When we say we are working to liberate Palestine, we must remember also that it is Palestine liberating us. Palestine is our mirror and our window. Palestine is our mirror and our window. The genocide in Gaza causes us to look inside and outside, inside ourselves and outside into our nation and to the world. We mourn the 30,000 murdered in Gaza, and we also mourn a young man named Aaron Bushnell. October 7th changed everything, but it changed things more for some than others. For many here tonight who have supported Palestine with open eyes, the shock was the extreme brutality and cruelty with which Israel pursues the final solution of the long-sought ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It literally is beyond our ability to imagine the worst. This one time, Netanyahu and Gallant spoke the truth. The present genocide has killed more Palestinians and displaced a greater number than the Nakba of 1948 and the Naksa of 1967 combined. It is the new Nakba. October 7th caused those on the fence to get off the fence and firmly plant their feet where they should have been long ago. It caused those on the other side of the fence to peer across, and many crossed over and were welcomed. To a great many more, it was almost entirely new, without the benefit of prior reading or learning. They recognized an unpardonable transgression. It is this new massive segment of people who have added to the ranks and are in the streets in their millions. They simply could not just watch. Gaza is not new. Israel is not new. Nothing is new. In July 2021, Norman Finkelstein published a book entitled Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, documenting 8 devastating operations against Gaza's largely defenseless population in the last 15 years. Hassan Kanafani, the great Palestinian writer and intellectual, who himself was martyred in a car bomb in July 1972, wrote only months earlier, "The resistance experience in Gaza constitutes one of the most prominent historical experiences concerning the capacity of a small, poorly armed, and geographically isolated people to continue, given its conditions, a heroic and almost unknown struggle." In all this present horror lies the future, and it can be better than the past. Beyond causing death and destruction, Israel cannot do much, and many Palestinians seem to be ready to die for a chance at a free Palestine. Israel has been defeated by the Palestinian people. It cannot kill them all. Killing 30,000 Palestinians, mostly children and mothers, is not victory, is not progress. Bombing and obliterating an area the size of a mid-sized city may be a military strength, but it cannot produce a future, and thus becomes a strategic weakness. Israel has arrived at a wall of its own making and cannot go beyond. It is a spiritual wall, and it reveals its existential weakness, even amid all its power to destroy and to instill fear. Israel has achieved nothing strategic, but lost so much. Palestine lost so much, but achieved its place as never before in the conscience and action of the world. In summary, October 7th and the war in Ukraine are twin system shocks that rocked the status quo. We can witness and we can also participate in the inexorable march of reality as it has turned against Israel in the Middle East and towards a new alignment in the world away from US hegemony. A multipolar world of distributed power offers a greater possibility for imperfect peace than a unipolar world. This is especially true for Palestine-Israel. The last months have shown that the liberation of Palestine can only rest on the shoulders of Palestinians themselves, living in Gaza and the West Bank. There is no other way than to create facts on the ground. They are the resistance, they are the future. We here in North America, as friends of Palestine, play supporting roles to end the active complicity and shielding of our governments and public institutions. Both efforts are important and necessary for a free Palestine. I will end the formal part of tonight with a poem by Rafat Al-Arir, a writer, a poet, translator, and professor, and an activist living in Gaza. On December 6th, he was murdered by an Israeli airstrike, along with his brother, sister, and their children. 5 weeks earlier, he shared his poem entitled, "If I Must Die." He was 44 years old. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some string, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. This poem captures the total resolve of the Palestinian people, coming after decades of betrayal and abandonment. I interpret the opening and close of the poem directed at us in the West, that our task is to witness and then tell the story, in the constant faith that our efforts are essential to help Palestine become free. Let us not fail in our task. Despite being in the darkest moment, we can also see light in the distance. We grieve the souls lost and the lives destroyed. We live in the faith and certainty that one day Palestine will be free and its people will live in dignity. Thank you.